Hello, welcome to video number 15 in our series, Microsoft Certified Professional Developer 4.0 with ASP.NET and C#. The exam content focus is 70-515, and the content is owned and created by Ravi Nanganuri, Microsoft MVP.NET Videos.net. So video number 15, we're going to go over data source and data-bound controls. Both of those topics are covered in the exam, and data source controls, they abstract the data provider away. So you don't have to get down into the nuts and bolts and plumbing to be able to use the data source controls. There are various controls such as the SQL data source control, the link, the XML sitemap. Now these various controls, depending on what the data source is which one we'll use. As we'll see, the name SQL is a little misleading here, as you can actually connect to Oracle and others as well via the SQL data source control. And now data-bound controls provide you a way to display and work with the data. So the data source controls fetch and get the data for us, and the data-bound controls provide us a way to display and use that data. So some very popular and common ones such as the grid view, the forms view, the repeater, and various others, depending on exactly what you're wanting to do with the data once you have it, will dictate what data-bound control you use. Now, we're not going to spend an inordinate amount of time, just this one video here, covering these two topics for the exam. Often you're going to want to get more granular control than using data source controls and what everything that can be done through the wizard can provide you. Nonetheless, you should know how to use these and wire these up, so we'll show some examples here. And go from there. So let me go ahead and show you in the toolbox there is a data area. Notice I have the access data source, I've got the object data source. So depending on the source of data that I have, and in this case we'll use AdventureWorks from SQL Server for the example, I'll drag and drop this SQL data source on the screen. Now when you configure this, it becomes a very wizard-driven experience. Now you can do some programmatic access to these as well, but notice that I'm pretty much walking through the wizard here. One of the powerful features here is I'm not doing any coding, so to speak, to kind of wire this all up. I'll go ahead and hit dot there, which will show me my local SQL Server. In this case, I have AdventureWorks set up. I'll go ahead and test connection, and that works, and I'll click OK. And at this point, I've just created a connection string, and I've got the option through the wizard to go ahead and save that in my web config file for reuse, which is always a best practice, of course. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and I can actually pick various tables from the data source that I want to use. Now, in my case, there will be a nuance or a drawback for using data sources here, which I'll show you in a moment. But let's just go ahead and pick the customer table. And notice I'd have access to the tables and views here. I could also specify a custom SQL statement or stored procedure, which we'll have to do in a minute, and I'll show you that. But at this point, then you can just go ahead and pick various columns from the table that you need. So I'll just pick a few random columns here. What the data is important for the demonstration here. I'll go ahead and you'll notice I've got some other options. If I wanted to add a where clause, for example, if I want to zoom in on customer ID and only look at a range of customer IDs, or I want to tie that into something like a query string to help drive this parameterization of the SQL statement, we can do that. All of this done kind of through the GUI and the wizard here. Now, if you have an existing stored procedures, you can leverage those here with the SQL data source. You don't have to build the SQL statement out this way. This is just providing us one option to do that. Notice the order by clause here too. If I want to set this up for sorting, I can order by customer ID, and we're just building a SQL statement at this point. And if you notice, I can also generate insert, update, and delete statements. We'll come back to that and show why that might be important here in a moment. So I'm going to just cancel at this point. Now there's one drawback with the SQL data source when you're using schema for your tables. If I go ahead and hit test query, you notice I get this error right away. It says it cannot find the customer table. And I'll show you why. If you look down in SQL Server itself, you notice I've got this AdventureWorks database open. This sales.customer table here is in fact schema name.table. SQL data source does not handle that very well. So in this case, I'm going to come back and specify a custom SQL statement, and I'm going to need to use the query builder here. And actually, when I choose the customer table through the query builder, it will preface the name with schema name.table name. So that's a nuance or a drawback if you're using SQL data source to be aware of there. So I want to show you that. So in this case, I can again select the same amount of columns I needed. I'll just select some random columns there for the example here. And at this point, I can execute the query and bring the data back. You see I'm bringing back lots of rows of data down there as well. So when you're using a SQL data source, you basically can select, create your select, update, insert, delete statements, so your CRUD statements, and you can come in here. You have some abilities through the query builder to modify and tweak your query. I could be plugging to an existing stored procedure if it already existed at this point. And the idea is the SQL data source we're going to later on use after it has the data, it fetches and has the data. We're going to use that for our SQL, our data-bound controls. So you see here, I'm bringing back the data. I'm now able to test the query. I'm past that problem with the schema name, and I'm just bringing back some customer data, so customer ID, etc. So at this point, I've not written any code at all, and I've got a SQL data source that basically brings back some data. Now, again, a lot of times when you're building applications out in the world, you're going to want to be using more granular access in this. But if you see I'm generating this declarative code here, it's actually living in the ASPX page or the HTML. It's not in the code behind. So again, you still have the ability to write the raw ADO.NET code, if you will. You don't have to use these data sources, but again, it's an exam fundamental topic. You want to at least know how to use these at some level. So you see here, if I drag like the link data source or any of the other data sources on the screen, the concept's all the same in that it's going to go to a data source, fetch and store some data for me. Now the wizard experience will be a little bit different here, as you see, depending on what type of data source you actually use or grab. And once again, we should point out the SQL data source is not just for SQL Server. You notice if I wanted to do a new connection here, I could actually change this data source up here and use like Microsoft Access, Oracle down here, SQL Server Compact Edition. So it's not just for a full-blown edition of SQL Server, so the name's a little misleading there. So once you have whatever SQL data source control you want to use, another concept you'll need to know for the exams is how to understand how to use the data-bound controls. You see, it's automatically generated me some code there in the ASPX page itself for the data source control. I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop a data-bound control or grid view, one of the most popular controls to use. And you notice I can right away wire this up to a SQL data source if I have one. So since we did create one a minute ago, or any type of data source, in fact, it wouldn't have to be a SQL Server data source. Lots of functionality exists here via the data-bound control wizard here, like enabling paging, enabling sorting. Now again, take this with a grain of salt, if you will, in that sometimes you're going to want much more granular control of how the paging happens, for example, or how the columns look and are ordered. Now you can get a lot of the functionality. You can add columns here, remove columns, change look and feel, all of this right through the wizard. So it probably makes sense to use some combination of doing things through the wizard here to get things set up, as well as programmatically doing things, depending on exactly what kind of granular control you need. So keep that in context. And again, the scope of this video basically showing you how to use the data source and data-bound controls. So at this point, I've added a column. I could add, I could add this update column here. We'll show in a minute. Let's say that I wanted to make changes to this data and then update the database in some way. That's all doable. I'll kind of show you one of the nuances there, what you'll have to do. There'll be some extra step there on the data source side. But you see, I can very quickly build these data-driven applications by using the data source and data-bound controls without writing a bit of code, frankly. Notice now that if I click this update button, I'm going to get an error. It's going to say, hey, it's not supported by data source SQL data source 1. We didn't create that update statement that I pointed out earlier we need to come back to. So I'll show you that in a moment. But the idea is you can create these data sources and create these data bound controls, whether it's a repeater here or a grid view or whatever, and very quickly build some pretty robust data applications. So without writing code at all. Notice I've got this select statement here. I could get in here. I'm going to get rid of that top 10. Here's the update statement where if I really wanted this grid view to actually do something with the update, I would need to have some update statement here or a stored procedure down there. You notice the radio button on the bottom. And then you could basically wire the same thing up with inserts or deletes, and then you could, at that point, have functionality for your data source control that's doing more than just bringing data back. So again, whether or not you're doing all of this simply with data source and data bound controls, meaning I'm not going to the code behind to write code at all, is going to depend on your exact need. But you notice I've got paging enabled here by default. And again, it's a built-in paging. You may want more granular control. And the power of using these are, it's generating this code for me behind the scenes here, and I'm not having to do any of this, on my own, so to speak. Now I can still come in here and tweak this at this point, and take control, so to speak, out of the wizard's hand. I don't have to choose a data source there. I could just data bound this programmatically. But you see, when I've got the the flexibility of being in the wizard here, kind of configuring all this up, and it's stubbing the code out for me behind the scenes, with the code generation and such. So some combination of doing it this way and then possibly taking control programmatically can work as well. So lots of flexibility here though through the wizard for the grid view. Notice I can change the look and feel very easily by selecting a different type schema here with the auto format. I've got a classic, a simple, a professional. Just apply this, click OK. You can change the look and feel. And, so there's a lot of flexibility via the wizard. But at the same time, for lots of real-world situations, you're going to need flexibility beyond this. So you notice here, if you look at the code behind, though, I've not written a bit of code, which is really the power behind using data source and data-bound controls in the way we're displaying them here. This is one of the exam fundamentals, so we needed to cover it. We're going to leave it at that.